Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Échale Podcast. I'm your host, Jose Quintero, and I'm very excited today to be doing an interview in a podcast room here at Valley College in San Bernardino, which it's very exciting and it's very different because it's studio-like, and I'm here with a great friend. Let me just go ahead and tell you a little bit about him before we go ahead and start talking. Eddie Menacho, which is a PA, graduated from Cal State San Bernardino, and master's in USC. Welcome, Eddie.
Thank you, Jose. I'm happy to be here, man. And we've been trying to do this for a long time.
Yes.
Probably somewhere around COVID, you hit me up on Instagram, and you were talking about doing this, and I'm happy, man. I'm happy to be here, and let's get this going, man.
I'm just gonna go ahead and put him on blast. We've been trying to do other projects too.
That's
for
true.
the longest. I remember 5-6 years ago, he's like, "Yo, bro, you speak really good Spanish," and I'm like,
"That's right,
bro. We're gonna pay my student loans. Let's go."
Yeah, that's right. Hey, we got a lot of things in the mix, man.
Amen.
We can always keep it going forward for sure.
You know what? But I'm excited to have you on the podcast today because one, you're a person that I've always looked up to when we were at Cal State San Bernardino.
I appreciate that. You
and your brother, you have a twin brother. You have been through so much in life that to meet both of you was literally an eye-opener. I'm like, these two have been through so much and are still persevering in life, and to see the growth that you've had from Cal State San Bernardino to what you're doing, it's so on brand. I always had a misconception, I'm not going to lie, of jocks, just because I was never the popular kid in high school. I've always been the theater nerd and whatnot. So for me...
Neither was I.
Oh, right? You were, to me,
I wasn't a theater nerd, but no, yeah, I got you.
Yeah, but to me, when I'm like, all right, cool. Now we go to college, and for the most part, all the people in sports had their own parties and whatnot.
Yeah.
They hung out together. So when you and your brother came to work at the Career Center, I'm like, oh, I wonder how they're going to be. Are they going to be assholes? Or are they just going to be the bullies? Because you both were in the soccer team.
Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously to get to play soccer at a college level, you've definitely had to have a lot of dedication in your high school.
Definitely.
So you were definitely in varsity. So, you come with all these misconceptions, all these traumas that I had as a kid. I was like, oh, there they are.
Yeah, I didn't know about any of this. Yeah, but
no,
I hear you.
I'm saying it now. But you guys were amazing, supportive, out and about. You guys were for the community. And one day, I forgot where we were. I actually had a conversation with both of you, and I understood why you were both humble, hardworking, mature at such a young age. So I want to go ahead and start with your childhood. Tell me, how was Eddie as a child? I'm going to leave Tony out of the equation.
Yeah. So Tony is my brother. Shout out to Tony. I mean, I wish he could be here. We could both be speaking here, but it's hard to say that I matured. I was a mature person my whole life. I couldn't say that. I would say, there was a mentor I had in my life. His name was Dr. LaHenry when I was at USC, and he brought this moment to me, and he had an open door policy, and I thank him for this. And I sat down with him, and I was going through something, and I sat down with him, and he told me about what's called a kyros moment. A kyros moment is it's a Greek word for something that changes in your life, a pivotal moment that changes your life. And you can have multiple kairos moments, right? It doesn't have to just be one, right? You could be, you finding your profession, you finding the love of your life, you being able to change the projection of where you're going to go in your life. And for me, everything was always about soccer. My dad played soccer. He always wanted me to play soccer. So my brother and I were, we were the kids waking up at 4 to go for a run, come back home, do our homework, go to training and do extra trainings and, practice on our weak foot and do all these kind of things to be successful in soccer. And then when we got to we did well in high school. We got in the varsity team. We went to college and played. And at 18, I didn't know anything other than soccer. My study methods in soccer were the same as the people on the soccer team where, I went and I literally just prepared 10 minutes before the class. I review the chapter review or whatever it may be, go and not do well. All that to say, that happened my first quarter, second quarter, my dad got sick. And when my dad got sick, and my dad had been disabled for the last 6 years of his life, and at that time when he got sick, it was a shift change in that moment because he was always sick, and he would go to the doctor and he would come back home and he would be in bed for a bit. He would take us to soccer practice and run around a little bit, and and he would be in bed for 2 days. And this is probably where it stems, like my ability to care for people. I did this since I was 11, taking care of my dad, cooking for him, cleaning for him. If he called me and I was at a friend's house, I was gone in a second. I'm gonna go check on my dad, you know. But at 18, he got really sick. One day he woke up with a mass on his neck, and I remember thinking to myself, like, you know, at that time, my story, my mom and dad they met in Jersey. My dad's from Peru, my mom's from Cuba. They met in Jersey. There was a lot of things in our family that wasn't going the way that they wanted to. They didn't want me to grow up in that environment. And so my dad literally drove a car from Jersey to San Diego, where I was born. And so, you know, you grow up in California. California, around a lot of Mexican culture, and you know, Mexican culture, they know their cousins, their cousins, and so on and so forth. They know all their tios and tias. And I didn't grow up with that. I didn't grow up with uncles, aunts. I know some distant uncles and people that would come and visit us in California, but I didn't grow up around that. I only grew up around my immediate family, and it was always just us, and we struggled. But it was a struggle to get to a higher place in society, and as far as like our socioeconomic status would always try to grow, and it was only us. So and I didn't know anything about medicine. Needless to say, like I had nobody to look up to. I had no mentorship other than my father, and he taught me a lot. He was a very smart individual. He read books for fun and taught me how to play chess when I was super young. He was just a very influential person. At 18, he had this mass on his neck, and I knew nothing about what was going on. You're like, oh, okay, he's sick. He doesn't look good. He's feeling weak. You know,
are you in San Diego still?
No. I was 18, so I was at Cal State San Bernardino.
Okay.
And I remember one day walking in. This is before he went to the hospital, and I started noticing, you know, something was wrong with him. I walk in. This is before one of my games, one of my spring league games. I go in, and he's wrapping his whole leg with the ace bandage. He had already wrapped his whole left leg. Now he's wrapping his whole right leg from the bottom up, and I'm like, I've never seen this before. Literally from the ankle all the way up to the thigh, and I'm like, you know, what's going on, Dad? What, you know, you hurting? What's going on? He's like, I'm just in pain, like deep pain. And if you're in medicine, you know, if deep-seated pain, it's probably some type of bone pain, and it's hard to point out. It's not a muscular thing. It's just super deep. And at that point, you would imagine that you have to think cancer until proven otherwise. He went in. He had a mass on his neck. A few weeks later, he went in. He got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and within a couple months, he passed away. And at that time, I knew nothing about medicine. I knew nothing about anything else I wanted to do but soccer. And my whole life shifted because that was my idol. That was a person that would come and watch me at my soccer games and cheer us on and do all this kind of stuff. And I remember thinking to myself when I was sitting in that office with Dr. LaHenry, and he said, you know, what's your kyros moment, the kyros moment in your life? I said, the kyros moment in my life was when my dad passed away, because at that point, you know, there were certain things that happened in my life. And I think about this, and when I'm reading books, and I love to read, and there are certain books that stand out to me. There's a book called The Alchemist, and it talks about when you put your dream out into the universe conspires to help you achieve it. And I remember thinking to myself when my dad was passing away in the hospital, and I was seeing this man that I saw and that I looked up to literally become a shell of himself, not remember my name, and, you know, become literally just bones. And it was just such a surreal thing, because like I said, I only had my family. If I had uncles and aunts, I don't know if it would have been different, and grandparents are always around, and if I had that, maybe it would have been different. But there was only 5 of us, me, my brother, and my sister, who I looked up to. My sister I called my mom for the first 10 years of my life, because my mom and my dad were always at work in San Diego. You know, we were just struggling to make a living. And then I had my mom and just my dad. So there's only 5 of us. So if one of us gets taken away, you know, income goes in half. My mom's struggling. She's the only person making money. And you got to do something. And I remember my dad, when he was lucid, it was crazy. So he had cancer, right? And he had 2 months to live. And they asked us, you know, do you want to go with this experimental therapy that was going on in Jersey, which is kind of coincident, you know, coincidence because they came back from there, yeah. And it was coming from Jersey, and we were like, oh yeah, you know, there's only a 5% chance that he's gonna live. You want to do this, and you obviously know it's gonna be expensive, but we couldn't just let it go like that, right? So we took the 5%, and before we had started that experimental therapy, and only lasted a couple weeks. Before that, he was forgetting our name. You walk in, he'd be hallucinating, and he would be in extreme pain because the cancer had gone to his bones. And I remember him sitting there with the morphine pump, just like trying to push the morphine pump. I'm like, Daddy, it doesn't go more than however much, you know, every 4 hours. And I couldn't imagine what he was going through because he was a very tough guy. He was like a bulldog. And I remember when he was getting the experimental therapy, there was a time I walked in because, we would go and visit. There was times I call, he'd be confused. This time, it was a few days before he passed away. He was the most lucid I had ever seen him. And I thought to myself, as like a young kid, know nothing about medicine, oh, he's cured, this guy's good. But I remember when he was totally lucid, totally himself, funny, because my dad was such a funny person, caring, loving, and he always told me, he had asked me to get him some food. We got him some food. We sat down, and he taught us some lessons, like life lessons that he kind of knew that something was coming on, like something was going on. Like he felt it, and you were there with him, and it was like a surreal moment. I was sitting there with my brother, and he's like, you have to make sure you take your time when you eat, like sit with your brother, talk to him, because like you never know when that ability is going to be taken away from you. And I remember he told me, he said, the one thing I want you guys to do no matter what happens to me is take care of your mother, take care of your family. The day after he passed away on June 8th, 2008. The day after he passed away, I had an interview at UPS. A week after that, I was a cashier. I got another job as a cashier. Mm-hmm. 2 months after that, after I had those jobs, I was working 2 jobs, getting ready to go into soccer camp. I had an accident where I was at the wrong place, wrong time. I got stabbed in my hand. All these moments were like kyros moments in my life. All happened in 1 year, 2008. And at that moment, I couldn't play soccer because I couldn't function. I got stabbed in my hand. I literally couldn't move my hand, so I had to have surgery. I had to go through this whole thing. It was too much of a risk for me to be on the field. Got kicked off the soccer team. Had to basically find myself, figure out what I was going to do with my life. And I ran into somebody, thank God this happened, and this goes back to what I was saying in The Alchemist, and that in my life, I remember thinking to myself, like, I did not want what happened to my dad or happened to my brother and I to happen to other families, because really what happened was my dad had this mass on his neck, and if you're in medicine, you would imagine that he has this is just not normal. It's like a softball on his neck. But because we didn't have the right insurance, it was waiting for him to get diagnosed. He would often tell me that he would go to the doctors, and doctors would label him as pain-seeking. But at the time, that for like 3 or 4 years, he was going through like extreme pain. He was having like night sweats and bone pain, and all these symptoms are cancer, because he had cancer when he was 36. He had a kidney cancer, so he was at risk already for having a recurrent cancer. Yeah. And people would label him a pain pill seeker, a pain seeker, whatever it may be. Yeah. And he would just have to deal with it. And so at that time, I remember thinking to myself, like, man, how does somebody have all the symptoms of cancer, have the symptoms of someone that's legitimately ill? How does he just go by without being caught, Yeah. And that's what's called the health disparity. So after my dad passed away, there was a person that was working in the office of kinesiology in Cal State San Bernardino, and she asked us, she said, my brother and I were looking sad because we're always like happy people, and like we get along with people and whatnot. But at that time, that was literally our idol. It was like someone that we looked up to so much. It was the most surreal thing you could ever imagine, because it's not only hurting us, it's also hurting your whole family. I slept next to my mom to just keep her company for months, just to go through that.
As a man, how do you cope with that? Because it's hard. I mean, if we go back to history, men aren't really taught to show emotion. So did you deal with death and with an idol of another man that you admire?
Yeah, I had never seen death in my life, other than to that extent. I mean, obviously, I didn't have any family members that I was close to even recognize that. But when that happened, I think one thing that most people do is they just go to work. My dad was a very old school, you just put your head down and grind, and you just deal with what's in front of you. I remember when my dad was sick, and you knew it was the end. It was like the last day or two. He had a brain bleed, and they told us that he wasn't going to make it. They literally came in the room, and they were like, this is the kind of stuff that we see, and we just say sorry. And we're like, what? Like, what do you even mean? I don't even know what's going on. We had no clue.
At that point, do you become numb of the situation, or like?
Yeah, it's like a surreal thing. You never think that you're going to go through it, and it shocks you. And I would never cry in front of my family because I didn't want to be that person. There was no other. I'm a little older than my brother, and I took the
younger brother, right?
Than my brother. No, so I have Tony. I have Tony and my sister.
Okay.
And so I never cried in front of them. I would cry in the bathroom, or I'd cry when I got home, or what have you, because my mom was struggling. And the last thing that because my dad had gone through multiple things that he had thought he was like on his deathbed, and he would tell me, he's like, make sure you take care of your mom, make sure you're the idol for your family, because, you know, if it's not me, I mean, who else is going to do it, you know? And so I would try to take that role. That's why I went to that job interview literally the day after he passed away. I remember writing like rest in peace to my dad on the application, just like as like, or whatever the paper was that they gave us at UPS. And how you cope with it, I mean, you go to what you know, you literally, I remember when my dad was in his last few days, and I was sitting with my brother outside of the hospital. I was like, you know, my dad was always about, he had a saying, he said, focus on your goals and never forget. And he's like, you know, the one thing that we could do to help like his memory live on is you go and you achieve the things that you need to achieve. And one was soccer, but once we figured out that, you know, he had this health insurance that didn't get him the diagnosis as fast as he wanted. He had this mass on his neck.
It's all the disparities.
Oh, check this. So he had a mass on his neck, clearly had some type of issue going on. They put him in a nursing home across the street from the hospital, and I would go check up on him, and he still had this mass. I'm like, hey, Dad, like, what are they doing for you? He's like, they're just giving me pain pills, and they're just waiting for the insurance to clear so I can get my
so the same
biopsy.
System failed him.
Yeah, and sadly, you know, once he got diagnosed, it was stage 4. He was really sick. They put him in the ICU, and he ended up passing away really quickly. But you know, when I knew nothing about health disparities, I came back to Cal State, started to sidestep with that one individual that was in the front desk at kinesiology. She invited us to do a research in health disparities, and I had no clue about what health disparities were. But once I learned about it, I was like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. Like what my dad would tell me, or what my dad would experience, or what my family experienced. I had another buddy that was more well off than our family, had a family member with a very similar diagnosis with their parents still living, and I'm just like, oh man, like this is just crazy how this happens. And so we entered the medical field to essentially make sure that people don't, so we can bridge the gap between health disparities. And so our goal, I remember looking at my brother, we were at a conference and we saw this individual, Richard Carmona. He was a past U.S. Surgeon General, speak, and he was talking about his story and how he had overcome adversity and all these kind of things. He was one of 13 kids, and he ended up becoming the U.S. Surgeon General. And we thought to ourselves, you know, if someone like that can do it, we can do the same discipline and same attributes that we had in soccer and apply it to school, right? And studying and pursuing medicine. And needless to say, once we did that, I mean, everything took off from that point. That was my Kairos moment. That was the moment in time that I was like, okay, like switch on. Soccer, I believe it like wholeheartedly that sports can teach you so much about life. Even and it could be anything that you're passionate about. It could be theater, it could be whatever. But sports in general, it teaches you discipline, teaches you teamwork, it teaches you work ethic, it teaches you to understand how to fail and come back and persevere. Teaches you how to work as a team. There's just so many aspects of sport that you can apply to your life and be successful if you do it right? Because there's a way you do sport right and there's a way you do sport wrong. Yeah. And so we basically applied the same thing we did there, brought it to clubs at Cal State, created the conference at Cal State.
Yeah, I want to get to that in a moment, but I want to really reiterate how amazing and the way life works. So many people, when they experience death, especially of a loved one, they'll immediately go into this dark place or a place of anger where they're just angry with the world. And what I'm hearing from you and your brother, what you're saying is you weren't. You took it as okay, this is the teachings. You literally took his teachings and have been applying them to life. And since day 1 or day 2, since you started applying, you said, how do I honor his memory? How do I continue fighting for myself, for my family? At any point, did you seek therapy to take care of yourself? Because right now you're running on autopilot on what he's taught you all these years and on survival mode to a certain extent. But at any point in time, did you take a step back and say, I need to fix me too. I never healed that 18-year-old.
Yeah.
Or coped with it.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure if I ever dealt with, like, if I ever went to therapy for that specifically. That's a good question. I think I feel that as I went on that journey and into medicine, and I started, both my brother and I were accomplishing different things. We had good support from my family. My sister was great. My mom was great. You know, after we got through our grieving, it was like, yo, you know, we're cohesive as anybody. You know, even though we were small, we were very close, very, very close. And so if anybody was going through anything, like if I said something's wrong with my kid right now, my mom will be there, my sister will be there, like somebody will be there. Even if you have to drive 6 hours, 8 hours, fly, whatever, like that's just what it is. That's how we are. You know, that's how my dad raised me. And so through the support there, but I think the other thing, you know, therapy comes through talking to people, right? Like therapy that's essentially what it is. You talk to people and you talk about your problems. And what comes into fruition at that point, this is really interesting. I had a coach that I look up to so much. His name is Gerard Solozano. He was my high school soccer coach. And I've had the privilege to coach with him afterwards, but I was coaching at a few other high schools, and the reason at the time people don't understand and the influence people have in your life, and a lot of times it's just like one person that does that. And sometimes you don't even realize it's that person until way later in your life. You're like, oh man, my dad taught me that, or this person taught me that. Thank God they told me that. Because intuitively I'm like taking it in and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm applying that here and I'm applying it there. But if you reflect on it and take the time to think critically and think to yourself, this is where I learned that. And now that you're saying this, I feel that after my dad passed away, we were delved deep in soccer, and I was angry. I was a very angry person. That's partially the reason why I got kicked off the soccer team, was because I had gone through this injury. My dad was gone. You know, people would bring up problems about whatever they were going through, and I thought to myself, okay, this is nothing. I literally just saw my dad pass away, and I was very angry inside. Fast forward, maybe within a year, I went to a soccer game to watch some of my friends play at Chafee College, and Gerard Solozano was there, my high school soccer coach, and he was sitting next to both my brother and I, and we're watching, and we see him, and like, so we go over there and we say, hey, Solo, we call him Solo, hey, Solo, how's it going, whatever, and we tell him what's going on. We say, hey, no, you know, he asked, you know, how's your dad? And we're like, oh, he just passed away a few months ago. And he's like, this is one of those individuals that I look up to so much, because when you talk to him, he makes you feel known. Yeah. Like, there's people that can really listen to you, and people that are listening to respond or listening to listen. There's a big difference. And his presence just makes you feel like, okay, this guy's really listening to me. Like, finally, there's somebody that wants to hear what I say, because a lot of times, even at a funeral or afterwards or whatever it may be, you're talking to people and they're saying, let me know if you need anything, call me. It's like, do you really mean that? Or like, who actually is listening to your problems or the issues that you're going through? And we started telling them what's going on with us, and our family was struggling. And the first thing he said was, why don't you come coach with us? Come coach high school with us. So we did. And honestly, it was one of the things that when you're around a person like that, which goes back to the idea of like, you're the average of the 5 people you put yourself around, right? You know, it's the idea that if you hang around the barbershop long enough, you're going to end up with a cut. And when I was around him, the goodness that he had for people, the discipline that he had for the students that he had, or the athletes that he had, the accountability, responsibility, the endless work ethic. I mean, there's so many lessons that this man would teach people that I was being taught the same thing when I was in high school, but I didn't realize it as I was on the flip end of it, because first I was a student athlete being coached by him, and then actually coaching it and seeing kids that were very much like me, and seeing what the lessons that he taught was so crucial to me at that time, was because I was going through so much that I needed an outing. And I didn't need any outing, right? Because I could have taken an outing in drugs and alcohol and women and whatever. I could have done any of that. But I took an outing in something that I love, which was soccer. And I did play soccer. But I think coaching soccer was a whole different phenomenon, because you see kids that also go through their own traumas, because everybody has their own traumas. And it just changed for me. There was a moment too, and when I was at Cal State, I was talking to somebody, And I remember I was holding on to this grudge for a long time because a lot of trauma happened in that year. I lost my dad. I got stabbed. I had surgery. I got kicked off the soccer team within like real quick.
Were you still in school at Cal State San Bernardino, or did you take a sabbatical?
No, I stayed.
Okay.
Yeah, I stayed in school, and I remember talking to, before I got released, I was talking to one of the players there, and I was telling him my story, and he started telling me his story, and his story was so much worse than mine. And I was like, okay, this is like clear as day, just like one example. I'm one, and there's always going to be a worse story.
Yeah.
And so I thought to myself, I'm like, okay, I need to stop like harboring this, because though my story is bad and I've gone through a lot of different things, like there's people worse off, and everybody has a right to be mad about, even if it's a small thing or what have you. But those perspectives combined were huge for me. And right after I stopped coaching, I was gone on to pursue medicine. Along that journey in medicine, I think I tell this to students all the time, like, you have to enjoy your journey. And I'm sure you did this in radio, where like you're going through the ranks of growing as a radio host, and you're meeting all these different people, and all these different people are giving you feedback, and you can take everything with a grain of salt and say, you know, I like this, I like that, or whatever it may be. Yeah. In medicine, you meet so many people along the way. I mean, it was crazy, man. I both my brother and I did a congressional internship, which is one of the hardest internships to get in the U.S. And just along that way to get to that point, we met so many people that were just super influential. And you understand that at that time, when you get to that point, you're like, even then, there's just always more levels and more things to learn. And when you get there, you're like, okay, well, what do you do at that point when you get to that point? You have to seek people that know more than you, because if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Exactly.
And so just having the amount of mentors that I had in my life that I saw in that journey is what gave me like the feedback to get through all this stuff.
But the Kyros moment that you were mentioning, which is your father passing away, do you think that also allowed you to internalize a lot of the information and that your mentors were seeking? Because I'm literally trying to think as an 18-year-old, and even 2025, like the level, when I met you guys, the level of maturity that you guys showed, or the level of interest, whether it be in education, obviously you guys had a reason and a purpose. You guys just absorbed information and analyzed it, and you valued it more. And that's something that I'm trying to now understand. I'm like, oh shoot, the power of reading, the power of